Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. This video is about what should be a fairly ordinary piece of administrative legislation to tidy up the statute book by removing outdated references to the former Queen since the accession of King Charles III as the King of Australia. Curiously, it's been delayed for almost a year due to the opposition of those on the Conservative side of Parliament. This video will explore what is really at question here, which is possibly a culture conflict about the use of pronouns. But first, let's look at references to the monarchy in legislation. Prior to the Republic referendum in Australia in 1999, I ran the legal branch of the New South Wales Cabinet Office. In advance of that referendum, in case it succeeded, I had two major tasks to consider. One was how to change the New South Wales Constitution to cut the links between the state and the sovereign. For example, how would the governor be chosen? What powers would he or she have? Would the prerogative powers of the Crown need to be preserved, and if so, how? Would a state referendum be needed to make the relevant changes to the state constitution? See my Manner and Form videos. Now, I'll talk about those issues in a separate video. But the other, and I think more difficult task, was to go through every single piece of state legislation that referred to the Crown, the King, the Queen, or Royal, to work out which ones could be changed by a generic alteration, replacing them with the word state, and which ones required a more sophisticated analysis of what the term really meant in that context, and some effort to preserve that essential meaning while translating it into a republican system. About 95% of the references in legislation could have been amended without any problem, but about 5% actually required serious consideration. As the Republic referendum failed at the national level, there was no need to go ahead and complete this work, and the state changes were therefore not made. Although from time to time some reforms have been passed concerning references to the Crown, including the replacement of the oath of allegiance for politicians with a pledge of loyalty, but now that's changed again so that there is an option for New South Wales parliamentarians to choose to take either the oath of allegiance or the pledge of loyalty to Australia and the people of New South Wales. In the wake of the death of Queen Elizabeth II and the accession to the throne of King Charles III, the Commonwealth Parliament is in the process now of undertaking the much smaller, simpler task of cleaning up references to the Queen in existing Commonwealth legislation and turning them into general references to the sovereign, so that the process does not need to occur whenever a monarch of a different sex becomes the King or Queen of Australia. This is not strictly legally necessary, as there are rules of interpretation that adjust the meaning of the words such as King and Queen to accommodate whoever is the reigning sovereign at the time. Section 16 of the Commonwealth Acts Interpretation Act 1901 says, quote, "In any act, references to the sovereign reigning at the time of the passing of such act or to the Crown shall be construed as references to the sovereign for the time being," unquote. Section 23 also says that in any act, words importing a gender include every other gender. For example, Section 2 of the Royal Powers Act 1953 of the Commonwealth says, quote, "At any time when the Queen is personally present in Australia, any power under an act exercisable by the Governor-General may be exercised by the Queen," unquote. Due to those interpretation provisions, this provision would also then extend to the current King. So when King Charles III visits Australia later this year, he may exercise powers conferred by statute on the Governor-General, according to that Act. Similarly, while the Commonwealth Constitution refers throughout to the Queen, being Queen Victoria, covering Clause 2 of the Constitution clarifies the position by saying, quote, "The provisions of this Act that's the Constitution, referring to the Queen, shall extend to Her Majesty's heirs and successors in the sovereignty of the United Kingdom, unquote. In addition, the oath of allegiance set out in the schedule to the Commonwealth Constitution refers specifically to, quote, Her Majesty Queen Victoria, her heirs and successors, according to law, unquote. But a note to that oath states that the name of the King or Queen for the time being is to be substituted. So why is there a need to make any changes to tidy up references to Queen Elizabeth or the Queen in Commonwealth legislation now that we have a king again? It's not legally necessary, but it fulfills an important role in making legislation more easily comprehensible to those who read it and need to know what it means. Most ordinary people don't know about the provisions of the Acts Interpretation Act. They may well take a statute at face value and believe that references to the Queen are outdated and therefore no longer applicable. In short, people could be misled by laws that retain those outdated references. This is why Commonwealth laws nowadays always refer to the minister rather than the minister for whatever, because people will become confused when the title of the relevant minister changes, even if there is an interpretative provision which accommodates the change. Similarly, it's clearer to refer to the sovereign rather than a king or queen to avoid confusion. This is particularly the case when the king's wife is given the courtesy title of queen, even though she has no constitutional role in relation to Australia. People could mistakenly believe that references in Commonwealth legislation to the Queen might mean Queen Camilla rather than actually meaning King Charles. It is interesting that a Labor government is proposing this reform as a future-proofing exercise by referring to the sovereign rather than the current king, as this seems to be recognition that all prospect of a republic has been abandoned and Australia will persist with a string of future monarchs. It's also interesting that the opposition is objecting to the legislation. If it was the other way round and a Conservative coalition government was proposing legislation that recognised the change in monarch and a Labor opposition objected to that, there would be cries that this showed disrespect for King Charles and a Republican plot to reject the king by leaving outdated references to the previous Queen in Commonwealth legislation. Hence, I was quite surprised when I saw an article on the ABC website saying that it was the coalition that was delaying the passage of the bill, which was introduced by the government in October last year. What could be its concern? It's actually quite hard to tell because the reasons given by the opposition have so little substance as to appear to be some kind of a screen for something else. During the second reading debate, the coalition said that it would not support the legislation unless given an assurance that the King or the Governor-General support it. One might well wonder why on earth the King or the Governor-General would object to replacing references in Commonwealth legislation to the former Queen with a reference to the current sovereign. Such an objection would make no sense. Unlike in the United Kingdom, Australia does not have a convention that the monarch must be consulted and give his or her consent before a bill is introduced that affects the monarch's prerogatives or other personal or property interests. Is the coalition really suggesting that such a convention should be introduced into Australia after all this time? In response, the government asserted that the orthodox practice of the Governor-General being involved at the stage of royal assent after the bill was passed by both houses was to be followed. Then there was the somewhat inane statement by the coalition that such a bill should not be passed in the middle of a cost of living crisis because there are higher priorities. Now, this kind of argument that one cannot pass basic housekeeping legislation on topic A because there's a bigger problem over there on topic B is one that's dredged up from the bottom of the barrel when you actually have nothing else to say. No kidding, Parliament can of course pass legislation on a range of different issues, important and less important, and it does so every sitting day. So I then read the Crown References Amendment Bill 2023 to try and work out what the fuss was about and why the bill had been delayed so long. In most cases, all the bill does is remove references to Her Majesty or the Queen in Commonwealth Acts and replace them with the words the Sovereign. As the word sovereign is applicable to male or female monarchs, it seems quite a sensible reform. It was also noted in the second reading speech that Commonwealth legislation commonly does refer to officers by reference to their office rather than their name, such as the Minister, the Ombudsman, the Commissioner, etc. It's therefore consistent with current practice. But when the bill addresses oaths of allegiance made by public officials, this seems to be where the controversy lies. The bill says that one should omit from the oath, quote, Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, her heirs and successors according to law, unquote, and instead instruct the person making the oath to, quote, insert the name of the sovereign, unquote, and insert the, quote, applicable pronoun, such as his or her, unquote, before the words heirs and successors according to law. Hence, a current oath would be to swear allegiance to King Charles III and his heirs and successors according to law. What I suspect is going on here is a pronoun war. The fact that the legislation suggests that there may be an applicable pronoun for a future sovereign that is not necessarily his or her may be the real source of the agitation and delay. During the second reading debate, the Assistant Minister to the Prime Minister had to give an assurance that the person who determined what the relevant pronoun was would be the relevant sovereign rather than the person taking the oath. This bill would accommodate the prospect of future monarchs changing gender or declaring themselves non-binary and adopting a different pronoun. Perhaps it was safer in the old days when the royal pronoun was we or one. In terms of the amendments proposed to this bill, Bob Katter in the House of Representatives moved that all references to the monarchy or the British sovereign be omitted from the relevant acts listed in the bill, and instead there be substituted the words sovereign people of Australia. This would lead to the rather bizarre result that the reference to the Queen's birthday holiday in the Fair Work Act 2009 would become a reference to the sovereign people of Australia's birthday. Although, to be fair, the date of the Queen's birthday actually wasn't ever the Queen's birthday and is not the King's birthday either, so any way you look at it, it's rather anomalous. More significantly, if Katter's amendment had been passed, then under the Royal Powers Act, when the sovereign people of Australia are personally present in Australia, they would be able to exercise any power conferred by statute upon the Governor-General. And that, as you can imagine, would lead to chaos. So there's no prizes for guessing that this particular amendment was defeated. In the Senate, Senator Lydia Thorpe, who's probably best known for being forced to take the oath of allegiance twice after she tried to change the words of it to refer to the colonising Queen, has proposed an amendment to replace the second reading of this bill with a resolution recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as having never ceded sovereignty and therefore being the true sovereigns of these lands, waters and skies, and also, amongst other things, that the British Crown must be held to account for the atrocity of crimes committed in its name. I very much doubt that this resolution will be passed either. The opposition has proposed an amendment to the second reading saying that further consideration of the bill should be deferred until the government tables a letter in the Senate stating that the government has consulted with the King or the Governor-General on the King's behalf on the legislative amendments proposed in the bill and that those amendments are supported. The bill is listed on the Senate notice paper for the resumption of its second reading debate this week. Since the second reading speech was given on the 27th of November last year, perhaps it suggests that the government has finally secured the numbers in the Senate to pass the bill, relying on the crossbench, or maybe it's capitulated and sought the King's approval for these changes. We will all, no doubt, await the outcome of the bill with bated breath. Thank you for watching the Constitutional Clarion, and as always, I look forward to seeing you next time. Goodbye.